Plan on flying? It's time to upgrade to a real ID. Because in order to board domestic flights, your driver's license or state-issued ID must be a real ID, or you'll need another acceptable form of identification. So don't wait. Find out how to get your real ID at tsa.gov/realid. That's tsa.gov/realid, or visit your local DMV. And then you'll be cleared for takeoff.
CrimeCon UK is coming to London in 2025 on the 7th and 8th of June. For 10% off day tickets and weekend tickets, use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout at crimecon.co.uk. CrimeCon UK is the best weekend of the year, and I really hope I see some of you there. Hello and welcome to the Cult Vault Podcast, your dedicated podcast for uncovering the darkest corners of cults and coercive control. I'm your host, Kacey, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you for tuning in. Your support fuels our deep dives into these critical issues. Before we get started, a word of caution. Today's episode may contain discussions on abuse, including graphic descriptions of abuse, and covers a variety of human rights violations that may be triggering for some listeners. Please consider this as a trigger warning and proceed with caution. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be appearing at CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June 2025, and again in Manchester on the 27th of September 2025. Join me and a host of world-leading experts, advocates and noisemakers at the heart of the true crime community. This is the UK's biggest true crime event, and you won't want to miss it. Use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, for 10% off your tickets. And remember, there are flexible tickets and payment plans available to accommodate everyone. This incredible event is sponsored by True Crime, and it's always my favourite weekend of the year. I hope to see some of you there. And for those who want even more from the Cult Vault podcast, you can access early, ad-free content by supporting me at patreon.com/thecultvault, where every pledge not only gives you exclusive access, but also directly supports the continuation of this work. Thank you again for your support and your listenership. Now, let's unlock the vault. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I'm joined today by an expert who is going to talk about something that we've never covered on the podcast before, but it ties into everything that I've looked at recently in terms of coercive control and how it happens across contexts. So we're talking further than intimate partner violence. We're talking about further than familial psychological abuse. We're talking about so much more than that, and I'm so excited to welcome Maya to the podcast. Hello, Maya.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for having a nice little chit chat with me before we hit record about CrimeCon, where we're both going to be in June on the 7th and 8th in London. I can't wait. We'll talk all about that in a little while, but for now, could you please introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm May. I'm the founder and CEO of Safeguarding Animal and Human Survivors of Sexual and Domestic Abuse, which everyone is always very happy to know you can call SAHSDA because it is a very long name, but it does what it says on the tin in terms of kind of encapsulating what we do in the subject matter, which we work in, really. So we are an international organisation. So we work across the globe to increase awareness of the intersection of animal cruelty and abuse and general criminality. But my specialism is in the use of companion animals as a tactic of coercive control and behaviour, as well as animal sexual abuse.
To tell people that this is the organisation that you launched, that you spearhead, and they say, oh, I didn't realise that there was, a need to look at the safeguarding of animal and human survivors of sexual and domestic abuse. What do you say to that?
I think, it's not an uncommon reaction to have. I think most people, and especially your listeners, and especially the people at CrimeCon, there's a general understanding that those who harm animals are more likely to harm people, and that it can be a stepping stone to further violence. So many people focus on the link between, animal cruelty and serial killers. That's something that people kind of have a general kind of understanding of. But what I do is so much deeper than that. Like you mentioned right at the start, it's animal neglect and abuse touches all forms of criminality. So sometimes I play a little game with people and I say, give me a type of criminality that you think doesn't touch animals, and I'll be able to tell you how it does. And that's because it is so entrenched in the way that we live our lives now. Animals are part of our environment, whether that's in our homes or in some countries in the streets. So we have street dogs, for example, in places like India and the Middle East, and that's our interactions with animals are on a daily basis. Even if you do not have a pet, you will have some sort of interaction in the wider environment on your phones. They're part of our lives. So it's not uncommon for them to have some basic understanding, but then when we dig deeper, they can be quite shocked at just how intrinsically linked the two things are. And one of my favorite quotes by Mark Randall, he's a retired police officer but a specialist in international crimes against animals and a very dear colleague of mine. He said, when violence against an animal is inflicted, society has a responsibility to consider what other dangers that person may pose to the wider society. And I always start my training with that quote because I think it is very poignant and brings everything together really nicely.
And what inspired you to establish SAHSDA and focus on the intersection of animal and human survivors of abuse?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. So my background is really varied and I've always loved sitting at the intersection. So even from a very kind of young age, I've had very varied interests and they always seem to focus around kind of ethics and rights and philosophy and that kind of change that needs to happen to better the world. So I started out in kind of human violence only, although obviously I care about animals, and in fact I wanted to be a vet. That was my first memory. If you'd asked me as a child, what do you want to be, I would have said a vet for pretty much my whole childhood. But then when I hit kind of A levels, I realized I'm not very strong at maths or science, and unfortunately you need to be very good at that to kind of get into vet school. So I shifted focus really more to human rights. So I did my undergrad in history with a focus on gendered oppression throughout time and sexual violence as a weapon of war, particularly. And then I did a master's in human rights law straight after that, again with a focus on sexual violence, but mainly within or against the LGBTQ plus community. And then when I left university, one of my first jobs was actually in the coroner's office. So I was investigating suspicious and unnatural deaths, doing inquests, doing some bits in the actual court, so in coroner's courts, so swearing people in. And it was a really interesting job. I loved it. I loved the work. But I always knew I wanted to work in prevention, really, because what we want, we don't want people to sadly be passing away. So I moved then into frontline advocacy and support. So I'm a qualified independent sexual violence advisor with a specialism in intimate partner sexual violence. So within a kind of a partnered setting. And I also did work with some adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse who'd been abused in their family setting, so not by a partner. But and then I did work with some stranger related cases, but very, very few. And again, that's a big myth we often have around sexual violence is actually you're most likely to be abused by someone that you know and that you know well. So I did that for, overall about 6 years in total. I didn't, not all of it as an ISVA, but I did a lot of voluntary work in kind of the sexual and domestic abuse field throughout university. And then I moved. So I moved geographical areas and I started working in training and education. So for Welsh Women's Aid, who's the national Welsh charity in domestic and sexual abuse. And at the same time I kind of started there in 2019, I got my dog as a puppy, Podrick, and I found him really interesting. Cute name, isn't it?
Podrick is amazing.
Yeah, Pod. And he really was so interesting to me. He'd be doing things and I'd just be thinking, why is he doing that? What does he want? Learning how he's talking to me, obviously without talking to me in English or in our language, human languages. And what I found was that I was using a lot of the work that I did with children and young adults with him, although he hadn't necessarily been traumatized in any way. That kind of trauma-informed, gentle approach to how I would work with survivors, I applied to him. And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of canine behavior and well-being. And through that and making friends with kind of some specialists in that sector, I realized that they had almost no understanding of their safeguarding responsibilities. So I started off in kind of the non-violence and abuse sector with SAHSDA. Really, it was about upskilling animal professionals in the link between kind of violence against humans and animal abuse, so that because they're going into homes, they're working with whole families, yet they had, and often they're self-employed people that don't have a HR. They've never worked in where they've had to do safeguarding referrals. So it was important at first for me to upskill that sector. At the same time, I was kind of getting my qualifications and certificates in dog behaviour and at wider animal behaviour and applied ethology, just because I found it really interesting. So SAHSDA came about really as a mashup of my two worlds, which has led, which I enjoy massively, because like I said, I've always operated at that intersection, and I think that's what makes me quite unique as a person and a specialist, in that I've got over a decade in domestic abuse and violence against women and girls and sexual violence, and then I've also now got coming up 6 years also in kind of animal behaviour, specialising in dogs and trauma and animals. So it's kind of that unique mix of interests that really kind of drives me, I suppose, and how they just feed so naturally into each other, that it's that's what really interested me.
It's an incredible career. You've done so much. You've done so much in kind of not a short amount of time, but you've done over sort of a decade or so what some people do, over their entire careers. So you're really getting a little taste of everything and doing incredible work in all these different pockets.
I think I was lucky in that some people, they do much more exploration to get where they want to be or where they know they want to be, and I was just lucky in that I've known for so long, literally in my brain, when I try and think back, it really is college, like 15, 16. I knew I was going to work in kind of human rights, and that kind of interest has been there for me from day dot. So I'm lucky in that. And I think people sometimes do look at me, my age, especially because I look younger than I am, and they kind of don't take me as seriously, because they don't understand that I've got such a long background in it, and that intersection. So with history, that is looking at multiple countries, multiple angles, analytics, and then with human rights law, again, it was looking at domestic and international. So I just have, and I'm a sponge, so if I'm interested in something, I will just consume and kind of until I know it almost at an expert level. And that's what happened with the dog stuff. Is I was a bit interested in it, and then I just went so deeply into it that now I've got these qualifications and certificates, and it's because I'm just so interested. And I think it's part of like having a neurodivergent brain, but the ability to like make connections at a wide angle and at the minutiae is something that is something that's strong for me, in that I can just see things quite clearly where other people might not see them as easily.
Amazing. And soon you'll be Dr. Maya. Can we talk about this?
Yeah, we can talk about this. I'm very excited to be. I'm like, I'm like 4.5 years probably away from allowed to use the term. but my family have already started calling me Dr. Maya. I think like I've always wanted to do a PhD. It was something that I've, again, since about college, since I knew that it was a thing. And I'm really glad I actually applied for PhD funding straight after my master's, and I didn't get it. And at the time when you don't get things, you're like really kind of bummed out about it. But I'm so grateful now that I didn't get it then, because in those 10 years since then, I've got boots on the ground experience. My topic has completely changed than what it was back then. I feel way more comfortable and competent in myself as like a person, and I think that's something that research generally is missing quite a lot of the time. Is lots of people just stay in academia, they start in academia and they stay in academia. They don't have that boots on the ground, actual practical experience working, say, with survivors in a way that is like meaningful for a long period of time. So I'm hoping that's something I can kind of bring with the research.
Again, intersecting, blending of different worlds. This is great. And when we talk about coercive control, and you'll know about this more than I do, I touched on it a bit in my dissertation, and it was one of the questions I included in the scale I developed for my master's research. There are elements of animal abuse mentioned in Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act for coercive and controlling behaviour. So what can you tell us about how companion animals may be used as a tactic of control? And what are some of the signs that people should be aware of?
So it's in the UK specifically, it's a little bit different in some of the other countries, but we have this kind of separation of, well, crime and against humans, and then we have animal abuse, and we kind of see them quite separate. So that's historically what's been one of the big issues. Then there are some people like myself who are trying to get that intersection known more. So in terms of how animals are used as a tactic of coercive controlling behaviour, it can start literally from the start. So when you think about the entrapment process, and you think of the grooming stage, which is right at the start, if the victim survivor already has an animal, it might be that they are very interested in that animal. They might ask lots of questions about that animal. So what they're trying to do there is build a bond with the human victim survivor, and animals are very easy vehicle to do that, because if you have an animal, you probably love that animal very much. It's exactly like children in that sense of the word. So if the person already has children, they might be very nice to the children. They might give gifts. They might go on days out. And it's similar for the animals. They might bring treats, or they might give lots of fuss, and they'll be really interested in the animal. So it starts off with that right at the start of that coercive controlling relationship. If there isn't an animal already involved, they might gift an animal, and that's a bit like getting someone pregnant really early. So you've got a shared responsibility, an economic responsibility straight away. And gifting of animals can occur at any part of the stage, but kind of an easy example for entrapment. And then when we move into kind of the normalization and dependency stage, that's when they'll start positioning your love as the animal as abnormal. Because what they're trying to do is center themselves as the most important kind of being in that person's life. And they can become very kind of jealous of the other bonds that they have. They want them to concentrate all of their energy and time and focus onto them. So they'll start positioning things like, oh, it's really weird that you like the dog more than me, or that kind of emotional kind of gaslighting behaviour. They're as part of that movement of reality that they do anyway, the animal will feature within that potentially. And then once you come to obviously entrapment, that can look like threats to harm the animal. So one of the biggest myths that I confront quite a lot is we still think of animal abuse as physical violence only, just like we do for coercive control, with domestic abuse generally. It's the woman with a black eye, it's the animal with a broken leg, when absolutely physical violence can play a part. But a lot of the time, even with the animal abuse, it's much wider than only physical abuse. So with the threats, just like with children, for example, for my animals, I know someone would just have to say that they're going to harm my animals. I will do whatever they want me to do because I want to prevent my animals from being harmed. So only have to lift a finger towards them. They just have to say that they're going to, and obviously, I would believe them because of that environment which they've created. So that's quite a good example of the use of threats. Then obviously when they do physically harm the animals, it might be things like forcing them to ingest drugs and alcohol. It might be kind of kicking behaviours. Unfortunately, we do see animals being killed quite regularly, and that's something that I'm interested in focusing on from a statistics point of view, because we just don't know how many animals that we are losing. We've only just been counting suicide, but domestic abuse related suicide, when we're starting to count women or victim survivors who have died. So we're way behind in terms of recording any sort of level of animal deaths. And I think part of that, the difficulty with that, is I could go down the road now and get a kitten from Gumtree. No one would know. There's no record of that, and then I could kill that animal and bury it in the back garden or throw it in the river or whatever. No, like that. There's no record of that. If I've not registered at the vets, it's not insured. There's no trail of that, really.
Right.
So we just don't know the sheer scale of it. I suspect when we start to dig, it will become very, very concerning.
I'm already thinking about illegal dog fighting, breeding, reproductive coercion of animals, like forcing animals to breed for the purposes of, like cockerel fighting or dog fighting, or as a means of selling animals to make money. Sometimes you'll just see, I've got 10 puppies for sale. It might just, the puppies look cute on the internet, but you don't really know the circumstances behind that. It might just be like, oh, my 2 dogs have had puppies and now, we need lovely homes for them. But also it could be a lot darker than that, I suppose. And then you talked about the animal deaths, and that makes me think of the recent conference that we both attended together for the National Working Group for Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. And animal deaths, I imagine, do occur in spiritual and ritual abuse circumstances where people are sacrificing animals or people are using animals for witchcraft and leaving animals outside of people's homes as, like a sign of, again, threats, fear, intimidation, all the things that Evan Stark uses to define coercive control, even though we're not really talking about intimate partnerships there. We're talking about something much bigger. So I see exactly what you mean, Maya. Oh my gosh, you could just go so wide with all of this.
Yeah. So obviously I chair the subgroup for the National Working Group, which is the use of animals within spiritual and ritual abuse. And it kind of came about by accident because I mentioned, so I met with Jordan. I don't remember how we met. I think I just asked him, like, oh, I know, I went on one of his CPD, the really short one, the original one. And at the end, I stayed and I said, oh, have you ever considered, or, does anyone consider about how animal neglect and cruelty feeds into spiritual and ritual abuse? And he kind of, and it's one of, these are the situations that I get in where I ask questions, no one else is really looking at it, so it comes back to me. And that's exactly what happened with Jordan. It's like, oh no, I haven't really thought about it. Could you go and have a little dig around and see what you can find? And I couldn't find a lot, to be honest, because again, like, it's something that's often not really thought about or considered. There are a few, especially in kind of America, there's some kind of newspapers and articles about it, but no proper kind of research. But what we do find is the use of animals. So for animal blood, for sacrifices, animal parts, for tokens, in terms of accusations around witchcraft, like historically that there has been a connection between mainly women and animals, and then painting them as being witches' familiars. So therefore they are then seen as witches. So black cats is a really great example of that. Where that's not necessarily like an animal cruelty thing, but that association with animals, with certain types of animals, then feeds into kind of gendered violence and oppression.
Yeah.
So there's, like you said, it's just so wide, and it's so
wide. Wow, my mind is racing now. Because I'm thinking about all of the examples that we've given are examples of things that we've heard about happening in the UK as well. So you're talking about animal sacrifices, you're talking about animal tokens and things that you might not necessarily associate with a predominantly white, predominantly Christian nation. But we are such a blended country now with like a whole amalgamation of spiritual beliefs, spiritual practices, cultural influences. There are so many we're very lucky to be so enriched with so much diversity in culture and spiritual beliefs. But with that comes practices that are illegal in this country but are still happening, like female genital mutilation, breast flattening. People think that some people may think that those things don't happen here. They absolutely do. We hear about them at places like the conference that we both attended, where people stood up and told their first person accounts of being kidnapped and having to drink animal blood, and being trafficked over here to the UK and held hostage in their own home because they had, like the use of animal cruelty as a confinement tool to keep them in their homes. So, I mean, people who are listening might be thinking, hang on a minute, you're talking about things that are, far away from home, but they are not. I would imagine that this type of animal cruelty and all the other examples you've given are happening worldwide, and in some places more severely.
Yeah, and I think, it's really important that, we don't generalize to one community or one kind of country, because I think religion does play a role, but even in kind of like, Christianity, there's lots of talk about, animals don't have souls. There's conversations around, like, for example, Islam said that the saliva of dogs is unclean. So there is cultural considerations that we have to make that are okay. Yeah. So, for example, I just delivered training to social workers at a local authority about reducing dog bite risk for professionals entering homes, because they're often going into homes where they're going there because there's a reason. Either there's, they're vulnerable adult or child, there's a stressful situation, that's why social workers get involved. And social workers who are Muslim have the right to go to work and not have to worry about things like dog saliva. So what we talked there about is ways to mitigate the dog being in the same room, because for certain people, if they did get dog saliva on their clothes, then they would be seen as unclean. They'd have to change and wash before prayer, and it's not fair. You should be able to go to work and practice your work without the impact of
yeah, absolutely.
So that's a really great example there. So it's not just, I mean, I've had cases where we've seen vicars abusing animals. We've seen, I mean, we know that there is no sector of society where there isn't an intersection with abuse of some kind. So it's really important that we don't, like you say, don't pigeonhole it to one particular group of people, that we look at it wider. And that's the criticism that we've had whenever there is a serious case review, a domestic homicide review, is that information sharing and that professional curiosity has been lacking, because we look so narrow. And I think that's one of the things that SAHSDA is good at, and that I really push for, is to just widen that lens and increase that professional curiosity, so that we're not looking at silos anymore. We're not looking narrowly, we're looking at the whole picture. So what we talk about is SAHSDA positions is that you need to start including animals in a whole family and a whole community, coordinated community response to domestic abuse, sexual abuse, general criminality prevention and response. And if you're not, then it's not best practice, in my opinion. So that's what we're kind of pushing for at the moment, is raising awareness. Yes, is great, but my big passion is turning that into practice. So the practical application of knowledge is key to actual change and meaningful engagement with the subject.
Wow, this is fascinating. My brain is just like going in so many different directions. I'm thinking about, like, you mentioned the imagery of animals and how that is almost, it feeds into the cruelty of animals, like snakes in Christian rhetoric. Snake handlers, snake charmers, catching snakes and then what do they call it when they push all the venom out? They call it something. Milking snakes, right?
Because really interesting you brought that up, because in one of the parts of our flagship training, we talk about how our language and our views about animals feeds into perpetrators' mentality. So, for example, common insults like pig, swine, bitch, snake, vixen, they're often gendered, but they're also animal based. And that feeds into perpetrators' mentality, is that they're kind of at the top of the hierarchy. So they have a very fixed view of often gender roles, but also their place in the world as being, often we talk about master of the castle type mentality. And what they do is they position themselves either at the top of a triangle or at the center of like a circle. And women, children, and animals are kind of under them. So they position themselves as kind of often wanting that unconditional compliance, dominance, respect. This kind of mentality is what they kind of thrive on, and that's their motivating factor for abuse, is that wanting of power and control, and that's over everyone. And what you often see with their treatment of the human victim survivors is they will dehumanize them. So they'll then put them a peg down to equate them as animals. And then you sometimes will see that in the tactics that they choose. So, for example, I've had survivors who are forced to eat off the floor, or toilet outside, or sleep outside, or the sexual abuse is very animal related, and or they might bring animals in as a degradation and humiliation, which we know is high risks for serious harm and homicide behavior. So this is what I mean by it's not just about the link, and because in those, it's just that dehumanization, there are no animals being abused in that situation, but the beliefs as a society that we have around animals feeds directly into the motivating tactics of the abuser. Even if there aren't any pets in that family home, that, like we talk about, the language that's used is very animal related, and that dehumanization we've seen throughout history. So, for example, in the Rwandan genocide, which is something my thesis focus at undergrad, they would dehumanize the opposing group as cockroaches. So it's easier to kind of harm and kill other people if we don't see them as human. We saw it in Nazi Germany with positioning Jews as rats and as less than. So that happens we don't just need to think of it as something that happens in war and in genocide. Like, that's happening in homes. That language, that rhetoric, that mentality is present.
Yep. And that feeds directly into like Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria for thought reform, where he talks a lot about the dispensing of existence, where one group has a say over who gets to live, who doesn't get to live, who has a right to existence, basically. So that is, that criteria for thought reform applies directly to what you've just talked about. Civilizations having their, psychological profiles twisted, manipulated, and changed, but it also applies directly to cults. So the foundational criteria for looking at cults is Robert J. Lifton's work. So we're talking now about things happening in the home, things happening with mass genocide, things happening in cults. So again, it all links, doesn't it? It all goes across. And my friend who I was on my uni course with, my master's, she said that when they changed the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, she said she didn't like the idea of fawn because, again, it goes back to how women are subjugated and how a fawn response almost makes it sound like it's a weak woman who, doesn't know how to respond to trauma or stress or abuse. So I thought that was quite interesting. What do you think about that?
Well, I actually don't use fawn. So the 5 Fs, the 5 trauma responses, there's a little bit of difference in the literature. So when I talk about human trauma response, because animals also have trauma response, I talk about fight, flight, freeze, flop, friend. I actually don't use fawn. And fight, flight, freeze, flop, and friend are brain and bodily related. And so like I think the language, I prefer it not to be in there, although some would use fawn in the 5S for animals as well. I think it's about understanding the hormonal responses as well. That it is a natural. It's not related to your sex or gender. That how you respond to trauma. It's related to your brain and bodily functions. And so I can understand why fawn, especially when I talk about like male victims of any form of trauma, fawn might be something that could be seen as gendered. So probably better to be removed. But yeah, it's not. I think maybe that's the Americans use fawn more. In the UK, I don't hear fawn being used as much, but I don't know for sure.
Interesting. Oh my gosh, I could talk to you about this stuff all day. This is fascinating for me. What would you say if you were delivering some training and you were talking about, if you were doing safeguarding training around picking up on signs of potential animal cruelty, what would be some of the things that you would teach people signs to look out for?
So it really depends on if the professional's like entering the home or not. The first thing is to actually ask people about animals, because you're not going to even pick up on some of the signs if we don't start asking meaningfully about the animals. So we talked a little bit about the dash rick earlier, and we know there's a question on the dash rick. I personally think it could be improved because, again, I think it makes people think about physical harm quite a lot when we know things like, so not allowing them to take an animal to the vet and not allowing them to buy animal food. That's neglect under the Animal Welfare Act 2006 in the UK. It's also economic abuse, and it's recognised as economic abuse under the new Domestic Abuse Act. Well, it's not new anymore, 2021, but I'm used to saying, I think like 21 was last week. I'm used to saying the new 2021 Act just because we fought for so long to get the 2021 Act, and it's not perfect by any means. Yeah, I wonder what year we stopped saying the new DA Act. But yeah, it's formally recognised in the guidance as economic abuse. Stalking again, so where they might use pet trackers on the collar, you can get kind of this software that's marketed as, if you lose your pet you can find them, which is great, but it's obviously weaponized by perpetrators, co-opted by them, staking out vet clinics, following on dog walks or horse rides, or staking out stables, etc. These are all non-contact, non-violent, if you want to use that phrase, aspects of animal abuse within coercive control. So the first thing that I talk about is to get their minds out of only physical, because again, if you're not someone that sees the animal, you're not going to see a broken leg anyway. So I'm thinking about, your IDVAs, domestic abuse advocates, for example. We don't normally go into homes, so when I talk to people like policing and social working and all of that, where they are more likely to potentially see the animal, or vets. Then we would talk more about non-accidental injury. But yeah, so the first thing is I want them to actually start asking properly. And in my training, what we talk about is how we ask is really important. So what we know is survivors of domestic abuse and coercive control, quite often they will minimize what's happened to them for a variety of different reasons, which are all kind of valid to them if we use a trauma-informed approach. A lot of that is because they've absorbed guilt and shame that's been put on them by the perpetrator. So they believe that what's happened to them is their fault. When we ask instead about the animal, they don't necessarily place that same guilt and shame on the animal, because we don't see them as doing things that deserve the harm. So when you ask about the animal, you can actually get quite a lot of information about the whole family and the human victim survivors just by asking properly about the animal. So like I said, you know, if they're not allowed to take the animal to the vet because the perpetrator controls finances, you've got information there that you can extend and say, oh, that's really interesting that I'm really sorry to hear that they control your finances and they're not allowed to buy the dog food that you'd like. Are there any other things that they do around controlling money that you'd like to talk about? So you're kind of almost asking indirectly, but you might be able to get much more information if we ask about it. One of the other things I'm pushing for is that when we do intake into services, especially independent, that we have a tab on our intake that asks about pets specifically. So at the moment we have obviously victim survivor, or if there's multiple adults, we would include those, the perpetrator's information and child information. We don't have a pet tab. So I think if we ask right at the start, it gives us an in right away. So if down the line we do need to think about refuge and foster and all of that, we've got that information here rather than here. And when we're in kind of crisis situations where we're having to make things quickly, decisions quickly, lots of kind of risk management, and then when we know that there's a pet, we can include those in our safety plans and in our risk management, which at the moment we're not consistently doing or doing effectively.
And if you were to look at the way an animal is presenting, what would be some of the signs you might recognize in the animal itself that there is something not right with their environment?
So we just talked about a little bit about trauma. So for me, a lot of it is about their behavior as well. So they might be, so for dogs, for example, they might be quite reactive to certain people. They will have triggers themselves. So they might not, if they've not been allowed to socialize as young, they might have reactivity to strange people they don't know, or they might be forced to be quite aggressive. So what we sometimes see is perpetrators getting dogs that are status dogs, etc., or even not, but they will create an environment where that they purposely create the dog to be aggressive, and then they'll almost weaponize them, so threaten to set the dog on the children or set the dog on the human adult victim survivor. And for me, that's one of the saddest things, is corrupting the dog's brain. So when we talk about coercive control of the human, we also need to think about the impact that kind of behavior has on the animal as well. So you're corrupting who they are, their personality. So when I talk about dogs, I often talk about the legs model, and this is a model that Kim Brophy kind of launched in. She's an American applied ethologist, and it stands for learning, environment, genetics, and self. And at its center, it's wanting to understand that animals, not just dogs, but animals are individuals. So they're unique individuals. Just like every human is different, every animal will be different. They have their own personality. They also are sentient. So in the UK, we have the Animal Sentience Act 2022, which formally recognises that not all animals, but some animals, and most of our companion animals, have emotions. So what that means is, just like children who are living in an environment where there's coercive control and domestic abuse, they are not only impacted physically, more often than not they're impacted emotionally and psychologically and behaviourally. And so what I do is I just apply that similar vein to animals. So I think we should start seeing animals as victims of their own right, just like we have now under the Domestic Abuse Act. We don't talk about children being witnesses anymore if they're living in an environment which is coercively controlling. The language changed to them also being victims.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see that extended to animals living in the household to represent the impact that it can have on their emotions, on their ability to function, and also from a neglect point of view. So again, if they're not getting fed properly, they might have, or they're not allowed to have parasite prevention. So they might have fleas and worms. They might have mats. So if they're a dog breed that should be groomed regularly and they're not, they can get painful matting. They might not might not be allowed to go out to be walked, which is again something that basically they're not allowing their natural behaviours to be exhibited, which is very, very harmful emotionally for the animal. So there's lots of different signs that kind of range from emotional and behavioural. So lots of fear-based behaviours, or lots of appeasement behaviours. So they will hide. They might do appeasement behaviours of things like calming, lip licks, where they'll kind of do that. They will they might be kind of very clingy. They might have a secure attachment in the non-abusive caregiver, so they might go to them just like a child would run to their mum for security. One of the cruelest things I've seen or heard perpetrators do is prevent companionship. So the human-animal bond is a massive threat to a perpetrator, because what they do is they isolate. So you'll know this from they don't want you to have friends and family outside of them and their environment. Your animal is a direct threat to that, because they are living in the same house. Even if you're not allowed to go out the house, you've got that animal to gain some sort of comfort and friendship and love, because that's what they don't want you to have. So what they will sometimes do is, obviously, they might forcibly rehome the animal. They might get rid of the animal in another way, like, for example, killing them. Or they just won't allow you to be in the same room as your animal. And to me, that is almost like a torture tactic, because I'm just thinking of my animals and thinking that I could be upstairs and they're downstairs, and I'm not allowed to cuddle them or go to them or comfort them or be in the same room as them. That is psychologically very, very harmful to both you and the animal as well.
Yeah, definitely something that's used, family separation in destructive cults. Parents aren't allowed to raise their own children. Husbands and wives are separated. Children are raised by other adults. Lots of psychological, emotional, and oftentimes physical and sexual abuse of the children impacts the parents and the children significantly. Those secure attachments aren't able to form for those born and raised in cults that are separated from their parents, and that has a detrimental impact on the psychological well-being and future attachments of that individual for the rest of their life. So this is just wild to think about. The idea of keeping, my mind went straight to how women in abusive relationships are significantly more at risk of being killed when they are pregnant. And I guess it's the same type of psychological thing that's happening in this process of having an attachment to an animal in the home.
Yeah, so when they do gift animals, it can. So you might be familiar with the 8 stages of domestic homicide, James Smith's model. So which and her book is very interesting as well, from kind of a CCB intimate partner view. What I did was I looked at the 8 stages to domestic homicide, and it doesn't mention animals at all, the original model. So what I did was I added how animals would feature at each stage of the 8 stages to domestic homicide. And I'm also currently working on the version for the suicide version. There's 8 steps to domestic suicide, dispute-related suicide. So what I found was that you can look at each of those stages and see where animals would fit into them. So, for example, in stage one. Speaking of, what was it called? Stage one, which is like pre-relationship. Often you will see they might have a history of animal abuse. So they might have a history of animal abuse in another relationship. They might have a childhood where they've been harming animals, or they will be involved in something that's related to animal abuse, like you talked about dog fighting and things like that potentially. So a really good example, not a good example because it's horrendous, but the recent case of the ex-partner who went and he shot the mum and the two daughters with a crossbow. I've seen so much dialogue about that and coercive control. I said in my mind, there's going to be animal abuse there somewhere. No one's reporting on it. So I did digging. I went digging around and I found that he didn't have to my knowledge, he didn't have a known history of animal abuse. I don't know if he was known to the RSPCA. What I did find was a very short statement from a friend of his that said one time they were all sat together in I don't know, maybe a house or something. They were all together as a friendship group and he was like laughing at a video of animal abuse on his phone, and they all kind of thought like, oh, that's really odd. And so I know that I will find it. The problem is that when we don't ask for it, so for example with the domestic homicide, when I developed the kind of how animals feature in the 8 stages of domestic homicide, I wanted to replicate Jane's study. So what I wanted to do was go to the public access DHR records, read them, and find out where animals featured in there. I couldn't for 2 reasons. One, we don't ask about it in the form. There's no prompt. So SAHSDA responded to the public consultation on DHRs, and we recommended several things be added to the form to prompt that. The second is when you go to the database, I can't even search by the term animal. So it's not even a recognized term in the search bar. So I tried things like animal, I tried things like pet. The problem with the word pet is that the word perpetrator has the word pet in it. Mm-hmm. So I just came up with millions of hits for perpetrator. So I couldn't search by pet or animal. Or even dog, or like I tried breaking it down and I can't. There are some I know that have included animal abuse, but that's where it's like very obvious animal abuse, where it's like dominated by animal abuse. Then they will talk about it at the DHR, right, abuse related death reviews. But what I understand is it doesn't always look like that. We need to start looking much more at the subtleties and those things that we've just talked about. So, not allowing them to take the animal to the vet, or not allowing them to buy food. That's missing from the conversation. It's all about at the minute they focus on if there's loads of animals being killed. So obviously they're going to talk about that because it's a massive kind of hallmark and it's really obvious in that case. But so what I say is, if you are a person living in a domestic abusive household and there is an animal, that animal is a victim of domestic abuse, just like the children. So when we think about statistically 60% of households in the UK have a pet, mostly more than one pet of more than one species. This is massive crossover numbers that we're just not even looking at or thinking about or considering. And that's again that's our main kind of drive is, why are we only looking at like either the extreme or we're ignoring it altogether? We need to be looking holistically at the issue, which we're just not. But animal abuse is a high risk marker for domestic homicide, which is again why obviously they ask about it on the dash Rick. But I really question how well that question is really asked, and how well most people who are doing things like the risk assessments know themselves. So that's why obviously we are delivering training to all sectors on this.
Wow, this is so fascinating, Maya. Your knowledge is incredible. It's so vast just on this one subject, and there are so many questions I prepped that I'm not even going to have time to ask you about today. I mean, if people want to hear you talk more about it, they can come and meet us at CrimeCon on June the 7th and 8th in London. But some of the things I did want to touch on before we finish today, you've developed a dog abuse matrix. Have you touched on that at all in anything you've talked about?
It's quite similar to when we talked about kind of how perpetrators use abuse is very similar. So I think we probably covered it.
But there is one that you've developed that is accessible on your website if people wanted to take a look. Is that right?
Don't think the dog abuse matrix is public access at the minute.
Okay.
What is public access is the compliance to partnership planet model to living with dogs. That's available on the website as an article. That's not for that wasn't written for people who intentionally abuse their animals. That was written for your average dog person who loves their dogs, but they don't necessarily have a great grasp of, say, natural canine behavior. And we still, as human beings, we have this really high expectations on our dogs. And we have a lot of compliance-based mindset with our dogs. So that's why I talk about it not being intentional abuse. So people can go and have a look at that, but that's way more general. But obviously, if people want to see it, I might make it public access. Just finding the time to upload it to the website.
If you do, we can always update the listeners, and I'll put a link to your website in the episode description, just in case anybody wants to check out the website. Also, just the idea of changing the nature of something that shouldn't be changed, in terms of trying to enforce an animal to be compliant in a way that suits you, which is against, for example, dogs, a canine's behavior, makes me think of some of the things that former Christian fundamentalist women have talked about on the podcast, with things like blanket training, where you place a baby or an infant on a blanket, and if they roll off the blanket, you spank the child, or you hurt the child or the infant, to try and enforce compliance, outside of the nature of, because you can't expect an infant it's trying to learn how to roll, it's trying to learn how to move, it's trying to learn how to be independent. So that's kind of like, that's what that makes me think of. And again, just another example of how everything crosses over and everything is linked together when it comes to coercive control.
But with the dog abuse matrix, one of the things we haven't touched on is about aversive dog training, and that links exactly to what you're talking about there. So often people who are this is obviously my opinion only, but my professional opinion is lots of people who use aversive dog training, so punishment-based dog training methods, also are probably perpetrators or have a perpetrator mindset with the people in their life. So often their mentality will be very respect based, so they will want the dog to respect them, and that will look like that unconditional compliance, and they'll get to that through fear-based methods, because fear is a very effective tactic. It's arguably the best tactic if you want someone to do what you want them to do. It's not kind, it's not empathetic, and it's not trauma informed, which is why I don't agree with aversive dog training. I've never used it, and I don't recommend using it. But what you're just talking about there, in terms of, that's basically like punishment based methods, and just the impact emotionally. So it's really important to remember that, especially for dogs, they have the emotional capacity and cognitive capability of about a toddler. So when you're doing things like alpha rolling, which is when they'll like pin the dog down, if the dog does something wrong, they'll like pin the dog down until it stops struggling to show that they're the boss. It's so ridiculous. You have to laugh because it's just so ridiculous. That's like holding a child and like, being really rough with a child, and emotionally that really is harmful to both children and to dogs. But in dogs, they'll use things like an electric collar, the shock collars, or a prong collar, or they just have these massive expectations on the animal to do what they want them to do, and not let them be who they are naturally. So it's really, really upsetting. But I personally think that there's a massive link between those who gravitate towards aversive dog training methods and those who are perpetrators of abuse. Not everyone so there are some that use aversive dog training methods because they don't know any better, and they're not who I'm talking about, because it's not fair. If you're there are still such a split in the dog training world. So if you were to Google something basic, like for example toilet training, you might still get things come up like, oh, rub their nose in it, and that will teach them that they shouldn't poop in the house or whatever. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of that around. Some people who aren't abusive will do it because they think that that's the right thing to do. There's a difference between them and people that get almost like a kick out of doing that. And that's the difference between the dog abuse matrix and the compliance to partnership planet model to living with dogs. The dog abuse matrix is those people that get a kick out of it and kind of feed off that power and that control. So the planet model is for people who just don't have very good awareness, but they want to do better.
Yeah. Oh, it's just wild to me that when you talk about oh, they've had an accident, so wipe their face in it, could be applicable to animals, children, and adults. Yeah. I mean, if you take out the defining words, dog, child, adult, it could just be interchangeable. So I see exactly what you mean, about the need to move out of the silos and just look at all of these things holistically. But before we finish today, there's some exciting things to talk about. I want to highlight your future projects and plans and let listeners know about what you've got in the works before asking you to give any final messages to the listeners in regards to the work that you do.
Yeah. So it's a really exciting time for SAHSDA. There's been so much growth, in the last year, and even especially, we're coming out of month 3 now, but even in the first 3 months of 2025 has been full of meetings and plans. The biggest, coolest plans I can't really talk about at the moment, because they're kind of under at very, very early stages, where it's important to keep it kind of confidential. But that might pique interest. People are interested in finding out more about the projects, and like you say, they can follow us. Some of the things we can talk about is obviously we've launched some new training. So our reducing dog bite risk for professionals entering homes. So that's for people like policing and social services, and you go into homes with dogs that are stressed. So that's just getting them to understand a bit more about dog body language, how to interact with dogs in a safe way, that they don't know. We also will be launching at some point this year our e-learning platform. So some of our other trainings, the Paws Champions, which is our flagship training, which is recognising and responding to companion animal abuse as a tactic of coercive control, that will be also available through an e-learning, because we're international, so some people can't stay up to do our hours of learning, and I certainly can't do midnight till 7 training. I would be not very good at staying awake. We are also I'm on the working group for Ruby's Law, which is a campaign which is it's starting to include animals explicitly in Family Law Act protections, so non-molestation orders, occupation orders, etc., so that we should have that as a default, that we include animals within some protection orders. And I'm also working at the moment, got a few meetings in around extending that to things like stalking protection orders, so that we're really including animals across the sector, really, in those protections. We're also doing some work on housing and pets, because obviously animals are a massive barrier to leaving domestic abusive relationships, because many places private renting don't accept pets. Refuges often don't accept pets. There are a few exceptions. And we know that being separated from your animal is extremely traumatic for both the animal and the human. So many survivors, up to 95%, will not leave unless they know that the animal is also safe, or they will return to check on that animal, which obviously increases risk because they're going back. And that is not a judgment on people that do that.
Not at all,
Often
no.
we see victim blaming around, why is that bad? Why do they go back? Often it may be because they care about the animals, if there are animals there. So we're doing some work with the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance to try and get more pet-friendly options for the general public, because it shouldn't be that if you have an animal, you're less likely to find a house or more likely to become homeless. But especially in cases where there's domestic abuse and coercive control, is looking at what are some sustainable, innovative solutions to helping people feel like they can leave safely with their animal. We're also doing some work on animal sexual abuse. So the legislation in the UK is not as good as it could be. The way that we police animal sexual abuse is also quite poor. So both within an intimate partner, so animal sexual abuse within intimate partner settings, but also outside of that. So really, we liken a lot of animal sexual abuse to almost like child sexual abuse, where often it's the caregiver, the male caregiver abusing the animal sexually. We also know that there are very sophisticated animal sexual abuse rings, similar to our rings. And again, it's just something that no one's talking about, no one's looking at, no one's researching. But really, most of all, we want animals to be seen as victims in their own right. So we'll be pushing for, if we can't get that in legislation, that is the best practice, that we include animals.
So you don't sound like you're very busy. You don't sound like you're thinking about, all the ways that animals feed into the legislation that we have, and how things could be amended and changed, and how things can be enhanced to encapsulate more demographics of individuals, whether they be human or not. And that makes me think about all the efforts that are going into, the lobbying efforts that are going into amending Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act to include group coercive control and the coercion of children. Just more things that are missing. The Serious Crime Act touches on animals, but it all it really says is animals may be used as a tactic to isolate and control individuals through fear, threats, and intimidation. But it doesn't really go into the impact that may have on the animals, or the children, if there are children present, and how that may restrict a person from leaving their home. In the same way, financial coercion and abuse might stop a person from leaving their home. So we are pioneering in our country. We're very lucky to be at the forefront of legislation that criminalizes behavior like coercive control. We have a long way to go, and it is amazing that we have minds like yours on the case in looking at all of this legislation and figuring out how we can make it better. Yeah. You're going to smash your PhD. You're going to be Dr. Maya, and I was so excited, and I can't wait to hang out with you in London on June the 7th and 8th for CrimeCon UK, where I believe we'll be doing a panel together on the intersectionality of coercive control and how it is broader than intimate partner violence, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you so much, Maya. I really appreciate you and your time today. I'll put the links to your website in the episode description. Keep us posted on anything else that we might be able to help you promote in the future on this podcast. And I will see you in a couple of months.
Great. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.